Everyone at the office was grieving when he said his mother-in-law had passed away. But just a few hours later, he was spotted partying at a nightclub. No tears, no signs of grief, just smiles and loud music. Does she really not care, or is there something we don't understand? This story will make you question how someone should grieve. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. Let me invite you to subscribe, like, and share. Type in the comments section which city you're from. The office I worked in had a rhythm that rarely changed, the kind of steady, predictable environment where people quietly built routines around each other without even realizing it. Mornings usually started with the low hum of computers booting up, the faint clatter of keyboards, and the soft murmur of casual greetings exchanged over coffee cups that were almost always filled to the brim. It wasn't the kind of place where people were overly intrusive, but it also wasn't cold or distant. There was a comfortable middle ground, an unspoken understanding that while everyone had their own lives, there was still a sense of shared space, shared stress, and sometimes shared support. Over time, that subtle familiarity turned into something resembling quiet camaraderie. People remembered each other's coffee orders, noticed when someone changed their hairstyle, or asked small follow-up questions about things mentioned days before. It wasn't forced or performative. It just developed naturally from spending hours in the same environment, navigating deadlines, meetings, and the occasional chaotic project together. Even the smallest disruptions, someone taking an unexpected day off, a sudden change in tone during a meeting, were enough to ripple through the atmosphere in a way that didn't go unnoticed. Rena had been part of that environment long enough to be woven into its daily fabric. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, nor was she particularly reserved. If anything, she struck a balance that made her easy to work with. She participated in conversations when necessary, occasionally joked during lighter moments, and generally carried herself in a way that didn't draw too much attention. People respected her reliability more than anything else. She showed up on time, completed her tasks without drama, and rarely gave anyone a reason to question her professionalism. Because of that, there was a certain expectation surrounding her, an assumption that she would react to situations in a measured, predictable way. Not robotic, but composed. So when she walked into the office that morning, something felt slightly off before she even said a word. It wasn't anything obvious at first. She wasn't disheveled, she wasn't late, and she didn't appear visibly distressed. But there was a subtle difference in her presence, like a shift in energy that was hard to define, yet impossible to ignore if you were paying attention. She set her bag down more quietly than usual, avoided the brief eye contact she would normally make with the people nearby, and sat at her desk without going through her typical routine of settling in. No quick glance at her phone, no casual greeting tossed over her shoulder. Just a stillness that lingered a little too long. A few of us noticed, exchanging brief glances, but not saying anything right away. In an environment like ours, people tended to give each other space, unless invited otherwise. It wasn't until a few minutes later that she finally spoke, her voice cutting through the low background noise of the office in a way that immediately drew attention, not because it was loud, but because of how flat it sounded. She mentioned, almost as if she were reading from a script, that her mother-in-law had passed away. There was no build-up, no visible hesitation, just a straightforward statement delivered with a tone that didn't quite match the weight of the words. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Conversations died down, keyboards slowed, and a quiet wave of sympathy spread through the room. News like that has a way of shifting priorities instantly, reminding everyone of something bigger than deadlines or meetings. A few coworkers responded right away, offering condolences in soft voices, their expressions reflecting genuine concern. Someone gently asked if she was okay. Another suggested she take the day off, emphasizing that work could wait. Rena acknowledged the responses with small nods and brief replies, thanking people in a way that felt polite but distant. She didn't elaborate on what had happened, didn't share any details, and didn't show the kind of visible emotion most people unconsciously expect in moments like that. There were no tears, no trembling voice, not even a long pause to collect herself. Instead, she sat there with an almost composed stillness, as if she had already processed everything before walking through the door. At first, it was easy to assume that people handle grief differently. Not everyone breaks down in public, and not everyone feels comfortable expressing vulnerability in a workplace setting. In fact, some people become quieter, more controlled, as a way to maintain a sense of normalcy when everything else feels uncertain. That explanation lingered in the back of our minds, giving context to what might otherwise have seemed unusual. Still, there was something about the way she delivered the news that didn't quite align with that interpretation. It wasn't just the absence of visible emotion. It was the overall pacing, the lack of hesitation, the way she moved through the moment as if it were a task to complete rather than an experience to sit with. Even as conversation slowly resumed and the office returned to its usual rhythm, that initial interaction stayed with us, quietly settling into the background like a question no one was ready to ask out loud. As the morning unfolded, the initial wave of sympathy didn't just fade away. It transformed into a kind of attentive awareness that quietly followed Rena throughout the day. In most cases, when someone shares news of a loss, there's a natural shift in how others behave around them. Voices soften, jokes are held back, and even routine requests are delivered with extra care. That same pattern emerged almost instinctively in our office. People adjusted without needing to be told, creating a subtle buffer around her, as if giving her emotional space even while remaining physically present. A few co-workers took it upon themselves to check in more directly, approaching her desk in ones and twos, rather than crowding her all at once. One person offered to cover part of her workload for the day, framing it casually so it wouldn't feel like pity. Another suggested she step out early, reminding her that no one expected her to focus under the circumstances. Even our manager, who was usually quite strict about schedules and deadlines, came by with an unusually gentle tone, assuring her that she could take as much time off as she needed without worrying about consequences. It was the kind of collective response that reflected not just professionalism, but a shared sense of humanity. Rena responded to each gesture with the same composed demeanor she had shown earlier. She thanked people, acknowledged their offers, and gave short, polite answers that didn't invite further conversation. There was nothing outwardly dismissive about her reactions. If anything, she handled the attention with a level of calm that could easily be interpreted as strength. But at the same time, there was a noticeable absence of the emotional cues people often rely on to understand how someone is truly feeling. No lingering eye contact, no visible relief when support was offered, no subtle signs of someone trying to hold themselves together. What stood out even more was her decision to continue working as if it were a normal day. After the brief exchanges of condolences, she turned back to her computer, opened her tasks, and began typing with steady focus. Emails were answered, documents were reviewed, and deadlines were treated with the same level of attention she always gave them. From a purely functional standpoint, she was performing exactly as expected, arguably even more efficiently than usual. But in the context of the situation, that level of normalcy began to feel slightly dissonant. It wasn't that anyone believed there was a correct way to grieve. Most of us were aware, at least intellectually, that people process loss in different ways. Some withdraw completely, others stay busy to avoid thinking about it, and some oscillate between both extremes. Still, human perception often relies on patterns, and when something deviates too far from those patterns, it creates a sense of unease that's difficult to ignore. In Rena's case, the contrast between the seriousness of the news and the steadiness of her behavior became increasingly noticeable as the hours passed. Small moments throughout the day added to that impression. During a mid-morning meeting, she contributed ideas with her usual clarity, even making a brief, light remark that caused a couple of people to smile. It wasn't inappropriate on its own, but given the context, it felt unexpectedly normal. Later, when someone asked if she needed a break, she declined without hesitation, saying she preferred to stay occupied. The response made sense logically. Keeping busy can be a coping mechanism, but emotionally, it didn't fully bridge the gap that others were trying to understand. Meanwhile, quiet conversations began to form in different corners of the office. Nothing overtly judgmental at first, just hushed observations shared between coworkers who were trying to make sense of what they were seeing. One person mentioned that Rena had always been somewhat private, suggesting that this might simply be her way of handling things. Another pointed out that not everyone has a close relationship with their in-laws, which could explain the emotional distance. These interpretations weren't meant to criticize her, but rather to fill in the blanks that her behavior left open. Even so, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty that lingered beneath those rational explanations. It wasn't about expecting tears or dramatic displays of grief, but about the subtle signals that usually accompany significant news: pauses, shifts in tone, moments of distraction. In their absence, people were left to rely on speculation, which naturally led to a range of interpretations, some more charitable than others. As lunchtime approached, the atmosphere settled into an uneasy balance between normalcy and quiet observation. Conversations resumed, tasks continued, and outwardly, the office functioned as it always did. Yet beneath that surface, there was a shared awareness that something about the situation didn't quite align with expectations. No one confronted it directly, and no one wanted to jump to conclusions, but the disconnect between what had been said and what was being expressed remained present, shaping how everyone perceived the rest of the day. By the time the afternoon settled in, most of us had tried to return to our routines, even if that lingering sense of uncertainty never fully disappeared. The office lights felt a little harsher than usual, and the steady hum of work masked an undercurrent of quiet observation that hadn't quite faded. Rena, for her part, continued moving through the day with the same composed efficiency, responding to messages, attending brief discussions, and maintaining a level of focus that seemed almost deliberate. If anything, she appeared more controlled as the hours passed, as though she had made a conscious decision to keep everything contained within clearly defined boundaries. It might have ended there, just an unusual day marked by a slightly confusing emotional tone, if not for what happened later. It began subtly, almost accidentally, when one of our coworkers glanced down at their phone during a short break. At first, there was no visible reaction, just a brief pause, followed by a second look, as if they were trying to confirm what they were seeing. Then came a faint shift in expression, surprise, mixed with something harder to define. They didn't say anything immediately, but the way they looked up, scanning the room before locking eyes with another colleague, was enough to signal that something was off. Within minutes, that quiet discovery began to spread, not through loud announcements, but through discreet gestures, phones angled slightly toward one another, eyebrows raised, silent exchanges that carried more meaning than words. Curiosity turned into disbelief as more people saw the same thing. There, on social media was Rena, clearly recent, clearly intentional, standing under vivid neon lights, dressed in a way that sharply contrasted with her appearance earlier that day. Her makeup was bold, her outfit striking, and the environment around her was unmistakable. A crowded, energetic nightclub filled with flashing lights and blurred motion. The contrast was immediate and jarring. Just hours earlier, she had been sitting quietly at her desk, acknowledging condolences with calm restraint. Now, in these images and short video clips, she looked entirely different, not just in appearance, but in energy. There was movement, laughter, a sense of release that didn't align with the context everyone had been holding onto throughout the day. Music pulsed in the background of one clip, and in another, she appeared to be mid-conversation, smiling in a way that felt completely detached from the idea of recent loss. What made it even more striking was the caption she had chosen. It wasn't cryptic or neutral. It carried a tone of relief, almost celebration, with wording that suggested a kind of personal freedom or escape. Something along the lines of finally being able to breathe, finally having a moment to herself. On its own, that message could have been interpreted in many ways, but placed alongside the timing of everything else, the announcement that morning, the composed demeanor throughout the day, it created a narrative that was difficult to reconcile. Reactions in the office shifted almost instantly, though still contained within that same quiet, indirect communication style. People didn't confront her, didn't call attention to it openly, but the internal processing was undeniable. Some leaned back in their chairs, staring at their screens a little longer than necessary, as if trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Others exchanged brief whispers, their voices low but edged with disbelief. The earlier uncertainty began to take on a more defined shape, moving from confusion into something closer to judgment, even if no one wanted to admit it outright. At the same time, not everyone interpreted the situation the same way. A few voices, still measured and cautious, attempted to offer alternative perspectives. Maybe the posts weren't from that same day. Maybe they had been taken earlier and only uploaded now. Maybe there was context that none of us were aware of, details about her relationship with her mother-in-law that could completely change the way this was being perceived. These possibilities lingered, providing a thin layer of doubt that prevented the situation from becoming entirely one-sided. Still, the timing felt too precise to ignore. The lighting, the immediacy of the posts, the way the captions were written, it all pointed to something current, something unfolding in real time. And as more people quietly confirmed the same details, that thin layer of doubt began to erode, replaced by a growing sense that what we were seeing was exactly what it appeared to be. What made the situation particularly uncomfortable was the proximity of it all. Rena was still there, just a few desks away, focused on her work, seemingly unaware, or perhaps unconcerned about the reactions forming around her. The digital version of her, vibrant and expressive in a completely different environment, existed simultaneously with the composed, controlled version sitting in front of us. That duality created a kind of cognitive dissonance that was hard to ignore. No one knew how to address it, or even if it should be addressed at all. It wasn't a workplace violation, strictly speaking, and it wasn't anyone's place to dictate how someone should behave outside of office hours. Yet the emotional contrast was so stark that it naturally invited interpretation. Was this a coping mechanism taken to an extreme, a sign of emotional detachment, or simply a reflection of a personal situation far more complicated than anyone realized? As the afternoon edged closer to evening, productivity continued on the surface, but focus had undeniably shifted. The story was no longer just about a loss. It had become something layered, something ambiguous, something that challenged assumptions about grief, behavior, and the expectations people place on one another without ever explicitly stating them. And at the center of it all was Rena, still typing away at her desk, while a completely different version of her lingered on every screen that had quietly witnessed the same unexpected revelation. The discovery didn't explode into open confrontation, but it undeniably reshaped the emotional landscape of the office. What had started as quiet concern now evolved into a divided internal dialogue, one that played out in hushed tones, subtle glances, and carefully chosen words. It wasn't just about what Rena had done anymore. It was about what it meant, and more importantly, what it said about expectations that most people never question until they're challenged. Some coworkers reacted almost instinctively with disapproval, though they rarely expressed it directly. For them, the situation felt like a clear violation of an unspoken social rule. When someone in your immediate family, or even extended family, passes away, there's an expectation of visible respect, if not grief. It's not necessarily about performative sadness, but about aligning your actions with the gravity of the situation. In their view, going out to a nightclub, presenting a celebratory or carefree image, and sharing it publicly within hours of announcing a death created a disconnect that felt, at best, insensitive and, at worst, deeply disrespectful. These reactions weren't fueled by cruelty so much as by deeply ingrained cultural norms. Many people grow up with a shared understanding of how loss is supposed to look: subdued behavior, quiet reflection, a temporary withdrawal from anything that resembles celebration. Even if those expectations aren't written down anywhere, they're reinforced through family, media, and collective experience. So when Rena's actions deviated so sharply from that script, it didn't just seem unusual, it felt wrong in a way that was difficult for some to rationalize away. At the same time, there was another group within the office that resisted jumping to conclusions. Their perspective wasn't necessarily that Rena's actions made perfect sense, but rather that they might make sense within a context no one else had access to. They pointed out that relationships, especially with in-laws, can be complicated, layered with history that outsiders rarely see. Not every loss carries the same emotional weight, and not every family dynamic is built on closeness or affection. In some cases, grief can be mixed with relief, guilt, or even emotional detachment. This group also raised a broader point about how people cope with difficult emotions. Not everyone processes loss by slowing down or withdrawing. Some people do the opposite. They seek distraction, surround themselves with noise, or immerse themselves in environments that allow them to temporarily escape. From that perspective, going out to a loud, crowded place could be less about celebration and more about avoidance, a way to push away thoughts that feel too heavy to confront directly. The caption about finally being able to breathe, while jarring to some, could be interpreted as a release from tension rather than a celebration of loss. Still, even those offering more empathetic interpretations couldn't completely ignore the timing and visibility of it all. It wasn't just that she had gone out. It was that she had chosen to share it so openly, knowing that coworkers, acquaintances, and possibly even family members might see it. That decision introduced another layer to the situation, one that made it harder to frame purely as a private coping mechanism. It suggested a level of comfort with being seen in that moment, which, for many, clashed with the expectation of keeping such reactions more contained. As these differing viewpoints circulated, the office atmosphere became subtly fragmented. Conversations that might have once been straightforward now carried an undercurrent of hesitation. People chose their words more carefully, aware that opinions on the situation varied, and that expressing them too strongly could create tension. Some avoided the topic altogether, focusing strictly on work, while others engaged in quiet discussions, trying to articulate feelings that were still forming in real time. What made the situation particularly complex was that no one had direct insight into Rena's internal state. Everything was being interpreted from the outside, based on limited information and visible behavior. This created a kind of narrative vacuum, where people filled in gaps with their own assumptions, shaped by personal values, past experiences, and cultural expectations. In that sense, the story became less about Rena as an individual and more about how each person projected their own understanding of grief and respect onto her actions. Meanwhile, Rena herself remained consistent in her demeanor. She didn't address the posts, didn't offer explanations, and didn't behave in a way that acknowledged the shift in perception around her. If she was aware of it, she gave no indication. She continued her work, participated in necessary conversations, and maintained the same level of composure that had defined her throughout the day. That steadiness, which might have once been seen as professionalism, now added another layer of ambiguity. Was it strength, indifference, or simply a boundary she had chosen not to cross? As the day moved forward, it became clear that there wasn't going to be a definitive answer, at least not within the confines of the office. The situation resisted simple categorization, existing instead in a space where multiple interpretations could coexist, each one shaped by the observer as much as by the subject. For some, it remained an example of behavior that crossed an invisible line. For others, it became a reminder that human reactions are rarely as straightforward as they appear. In the end, the division wasn't loud or disruptive, but it was present, quietly influencing how people interacted, how they thought, and how they interpreted not just this situation, but potentially others in the future. What had started as a moment of shared sympathy had evolved into something far more complex, a reflection of the invisible rules people carry with them, and what happens when those rules are unexpectedly broken. The following day introduced a new layer to the situation, one that made the contrast even more difficult to ignore. While the previous afternoon had been filled with quiet speculation and divided interpretations, the morning brought something tangible, something that shifted the conversation from abstract judgment to a more immediate human reality. It started when Rena arrived at the office as she usually did, on time, composed, and outwardly unchanged. If anything, her demeanor seemed even more controlled, as though she had drawn a clearer boundary between herself and everything that had unfolded the day before. At first, it appeared that the day might proceed in the same uneasy balance, unspoken awareness paired with surface-level normalcy. People greeted her politely, though perhaps with a bit more restraint than usual. Conversations stayed focused on work, and any lingering curiosity about the previous day remained carefully contained. But that fragile equilibrium didn't last long. Sometime mid-morning, there was a subtle shift near the entrance, the kind of shift that doesn't immediately draw attention, but gradually pulls focus as more people notice it. A man had entered the office, someone unfamiliar to most of us, yet clearly connected to Rena in some way. He wasn't dressed for a formal setting. His clothes were simple, slightly disheveled, as if he had put them on without much thought. His posture carried a weight that was unmistakable, shoulders slightly hunched, movements slower, less deliberate. Even before anyone confirmed who he was, there was an emotional gravity around him that contrasted sharply with the controlled environment of the office. It didn't take long for someone to quietly identify him as Rena's husband. The realization spread in the same silent, ripple-like way as the social media discovery from the day before. But this time, the reaction was different. There was no curiosity, no disbelief, just an immediate, shared recognition of grief in its more visible, familiar form. His face told a story that didn't need explanation. There were signs of exhaustion, of someone who hadn't slept well, whose thoughts had been consumed by something heavy and unavoidable. His eyes, in particular, carried that distant, unfocused quality that often accompanies fresh loss. When Rena noticed him, her reaction was subtle but perceptible. She stood up from her desk, her movements measured, and walked toward him. From a distance, it was difficult to hear what was being said, but the body language alone spoke volumes in its restraint. There was no dramatic embrace, no visible breakdown, just a brief exchange, quiet and contained. To an outside observer, it might have appeared composed, even appropriate for a public setting. But in the context of everything that had unfolded, that restraint took on a different meaning. What made the moment particularly striking was the contrast between the two of them. He carried his grief openly, even without words, while she maintained the same controlled presence she had shown since the previous morning. It wasn't that she appeared indifferent. There were small signs of attentiveness in the way she faced him, in the slight tilt of her posture. But those signals were subtle, almost understated to the point of being easy to miss. For those who had seen the posts from the night before, that contrast became difficult to reconcile. A few co-workers nearby instinctively averted their gaze, giving them privacy without being asked. Others couldn't help but glance over occasionally, drawn by the emotional weight of the moment. The office once again shifted in tone, but this time the shift felt heavier, more grounded in reality. This wasn't speculation or interpretation. It was a direct encounter with someone visibly affected by loss. After a short while, Rena gathered her things, speaking briefly with her manager before preparing to leave with her husband. The exchange with the manager was quiet, professional, and devoid of unnecessary detail. It seemed that she was taking time off after all, though the decision came later than most had expected. As she walked out beside him, there was a noticeable distance in how they moved, not physical distance, but something less tangible, a difference in emotional expression that lingered in the space between them. Once they left, the office remained unusually quiet for a while. No one rushed to fill the silence with commentary. The presence of her husband, and the clear reality of his grief, had shifted the tone of the entire situation. It was no longer just about interpreting Rena's behavior. It was about reconciling two very different expressions of the same event, existing side by side. Eventually, conversations resumed, but they carried a different weight now. The earlier discussions about social norms, coping mechanisms, and personal boundaries felt less abstract and more complicated. Some people who had been quick to judge found themselves hesitating, uncertain if they had overlooked something important. Others felt their initial reactions reinforced, seeing the contrast as confirmation of their concerns. But regardless of where individuals stood, there was a shared understanding that the situation was more layered than it had first appeared. What lingered most was not a clear answer, but a sense of unresolved tension. The image of Rena from the night before, and the image of her standing beside her grieving husband refused to merge into a single, coherent narrative. Instead, they existed as two separate impressions, each influencing how people perceived her, yet neither fully explaining the other. And in that gap between perception and understanding, the story took on a complexity that no simple judgment could fully contain. In the days that followed, the intensity of the moment gradually softened, but it never fully disappeared. The office returned to its familiar rhythms: emails, meetings, casual conversations, but something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. The story didn't vanish. It settled into the background, resurfacing in quiet thoughts, brief mentions, and the occasional reflective conversation that hinted at how deeply it had affected people's perceptions. It was no longer afresh to react to, but rather a lingering question that continued to evolve as time passed. Rena eventually came back to work after taking a few days off. Her return was, in many ways, consistent with everything that had come before. She resumed her responsibilities without fanfare, greeted people politely, and re-entered the flow of daily tasks, as though she had simply stepped away for a routine break. There was no formal acknowledgement of what had happened, no explanation offered, and no attempt to address the quiet ripple her actions had created. If she noticed the subtle shifts in how people interacted with her, she didn't show it. Her composure remained intact, steady and controlled in a way that now carried more meaning than it once did. For some coworkers, that silence became part of the answer. They interpreted it as confirmation that there was nothing more to understand, that what had been seen was exactly what it appeared to be. In their view, the absence of explanation reinforced the idea that her actions were deliberate and unambiguous. This group tended to adjust their behavior accordingly, maintaining professionalism, but creating a slight emotional distance that hadn't been there before. Conversations with her became more transactional, focused strictly on work, with fewer of the small personal exchanges that had once come naturally. Others, however, experienced the silence differently. Instead of seeing it as a conclusion, they saw it as an open space, one that could be filled with possibilities rather than assumptions. They considered the idea that some stories are never shared, not because they lack depth, but because they are too complicated, too personal, or too difficult to explain in a setting like a workplace. From this perspective, Rena's decision not to elaborate wasn't necessarily avoidance or indifference. It could have been a boundary, a way of keeping certain aspects of her life separate from an environment that wasn't designed to hold them. As time went on, the situation began to take on a more reflective quality. It became less about Rena as an individual and more about what her story revealed about the people observing it. Different coworkers carried different interpretations forward, shaped by their own experiences with loss, family dynamics, and emotional expression. Some became more aware of how quickly judgments can form in the absence of full context. Others found their beliefs about respect and social expectations reinforced, feeling that certain lines should remain consistent regardless of personal circumstances. Interestingly, the story also influenced how people interacted with each other beyond Rena. There was a subtle increase in mindfulness, a heightened awareness that what is visible on the surface rarely tells the whole story. People seemed slightly more cautious about drawing conclusions, slightly more willing to consider alternative explanations, even if they didn't always agree with them. In that sense, the situation had a quiet but lasting impact on the collective mindset of the office. At the same time, not everything changed. Human nature being what it is, moments of speculation still occurred, and not every interpretation was generous. The story occasionally resurfaced in conversations, sometimes as a point of curiosity, sometimes as an example in broader discussions about behavior and expectations. But it never returned with the same intensity it had in those first couple of days. Instead, it existed as a reference point, a moment that people remembered, not because it had a clear resolution, but because it didn't. What made it particularly enduring was the absence of a definitive conclusion. There was no final piece of information that clarified everything, no conversation that tied all the loose ends together. The two contrasting images, Rena at her desk, composed and controlled, and Rena in the nightclub, expressive and unrestrained, remained separate in people's minds, never fully merging into a single, cohesive understanding. And alongside those images was the presence of her husband, carrying visible grief in a way that felt more familiar, more aligned with expectation, yet equally incomplete as a full representation of the situation. In the end, the story resisted simplification. It didn't resolve into a clear lesson about right or wrong, nor did it offer an easy framework for interpreting human behavior. Instead, it lingered in that uncertain space where multiple truths can exist at once, where perception is shaped as much by the observer as by the subject. For some, it remained a cautionary example of how actions can be perceived without context. For others, it became a reminder that context itself is often hidden, layered beneath the surface in ways that are not immediately visible. And perhaps that was the most lasting takeaway, not a judgment, but a shift in awareness. The realization that people carry private complexities into shared spaces, that visible behavior is only one part of a much larger story, and that the gap between what we see and what we understand is often wider than we expect. In that gap, assumptions take shape, narratives form, and perspectives diverge. But occasionally, if one is willing to sit with the uncertainty rather than rush to resolve it, that same gap can also become a space for deeper reflection, where the limits of perception are acknowledged and the possibility of unseen truths remains open.